And we're live.
Well, hey, Michelle.
Hello again, Mel.
How are you today?
I'm okay. I think last week I said it's day number 1,403,000. It's week number, 563, it feels like, in lockdown in Australia. So it's tough. Well, it's tough for a lot of people
Right.
being in lockdown, but I'm okay.
Yeah, these are strange times. And we've still got all of the sort of regular problems that were here before the pandemic started that we're still trying to deal with. And that's a little bit of what we're going to chat about today. So tell me what's on your mind.
Well, today in Australia is Equal Pay Day, Mel. So I want to have a bit of a chat about what Equal Pay Day is, because it actually is in relative to my life is relatively new. So Equal Pay Day. I listened to an interesting podcast yesterday from BBC Women about the authority gap. So I want to talk about that, and I reckon that'll fill up our time.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm looking at some stats for the US around Equal Pay Day, but let's start with you. Let's start with Australia.
So our pay gap, our gender pay gap, and the gender pay gap, the way it's measured is simply all men's income, all women's income divided by the number of workers and compared against each other. So it's not about you and I sitting next door to each other in an organisation and not getting paid equally. It's actually about the average of men's earnings and the average of women's earnings. So we've had unsurprising but still distressing and disappointing news that our pay gap has gone backwards this year. And you and I have talked over the last few weeks about the impact the global pandemic has had on women. And there's a really great term going around at the moment, which I really want employers to pay attention to, called the Great Resignation, particularly impacting women and millennials. So we might talk about that another time. But so our pay gap is the difference between men's and women's wages is 14.2%. And basically what that means in Australian dollars is women earn $13,000 less per year, or $261.50 less a week than men on average. So, I guess let's bring it down. What would you do with an extra $261 a week, Mel? Because that's in effect what it means.
Yeah, what could you do for yourself? What could you do for your family? And, I think
your future.
Right. I think we like to encourage women to think about it's not just today, it's also your needs for the future. And you and I have talked about that on Lead to Soar in a couple of different contexts. So, I'd like to look at, share a few numbers broken down here for the US. And so Equal Pay Day in the US for all women, so the average of all women is March 24th. And what they're showing is that women in the US earn 82 cents to every dollar that men earn. And then when you look at a breakdown, there's some worse numbers, right? So Equal Pay Day for Black women in the United States is August 3rd. They earn on average 63 cents to the dollar of men. And for Native American women, it's worse. It's September 8th. And they earn on average 60 cents to the dollar of white men. So certainly when you look at some of those breakdowns, you can see that there are subgroups that are dealing with a much more difficult challenge here. So Michelle, when we see these things, obviously we get incredibly frustrated, but let's talk a little bit about calls to action here. When leaders hear this, what should they be doing? What should they be thinking? What should they take forward?
So for leaders, there's a really very, very simple thing to do. The very first thing to do is to do a pay audit. Now, I am expressly talking in the Australian context. In fact, no, actually, this is for large companies. So in Australia, companies that have greater than 100 employees are required to report to our agency, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, an absolute game changer in terms of reporting, because as we know, you shine a light on stuff and you have transparency and action starts to happen. So for employers, I want them to commit to a pay audit, but then commit to doing something about it. I get, as a diversity and inclusion expert and consultant, I look at lots and lots of organisations' data every year, and I look more broadly at workplaces and industries. What's really concerning for me every year is that whilst the number of audits, pay audits are coming up, so in other words, how much are we paying all of our men versus how much are we paying all of our women, and why, then you get below the numbers. What is concerning is then no action is taken. Still a very, very large amount of employers don't take action, which tells me there's something going on. Now, maybe there's not the resources to do anything more other than do the pay audit. You got to find those resources. Maybe there's not the appetite. Well, I've got to tell you, got to find that appetite, because the race, the war, the battle for talent, particularly female talent, is on. And and again, I'll hark back to, and I'll share the latest article I've read about the Great Resignation. Organisations are being assessed by top talent. They are being assessed for their inclusion, for their equity, for their culture, for their leadership, for their purpose and what they stand for. And, and I think particularly in the knowledge work, well, it's not even just knowledge workers, but particularly in those sectors where we see the skill shortages, if you're not an employer that is taking this seriously, you're going to be looking down the barrel of a talent drain. Firstly, your talent will drain away. Secondly, you will not be able to tap into the best and brightest. So that's the call to action for employers: audit and do something about it.
Absolutely. And you reminded me of another area where we can see this playing out, which is in corporate sustainability. So gender equality is the United Nations SDG number 5. So companies that are looking to position themselves as sustainable and certainly progressing in sustainability, we see many of them aligning with the UN SDGs, and that's one of the major components that's got to come along with that. So I think it's interesting and great to see gender equality, gender equity come up as a component of how we view sustainability today. So,
agreed, but importantly, investors are increasingly. We have a big rise of ethical investors, but also investors. I always think about Blackstone because they are one of the biggest investment vehicles in the world, and they are very overt. We will not be investing in companies that don't meet these goals. So, the investors are increasingly placing pressure on listed companies to do better,
as they should. So let's talk a little bit about what you mentioned a moment ago, the authority gap. So this is something that, I see as connected sort of to the inequality in pay, because it has to do with biases that we all hold from our societal upbringing and from media and whatever else about women, how women should behave, what does authority look like, what does a leader look like? So talk to us, what is the authority gap and how does it impact women?
Yeah, so the authority gap, I listened to a podcast on BBC Women yesterday, and the authority gap is a new book that has been released, and the author was being interviewed. And I guess in essence, the key takeouts are that this authority gap, which is, and so many women who are listening will go, what is it? It's when you sit at the table and no one takes any notice of what you're saying. Basically, they don't command authority for their ideas, for their contributions, for their accomplishments. And the very first part of the podcast is the Pope visited Ireland, and Ireland has a woman prime minister, and the Pope leaned over to her husband and said, "Oh, what's it like being married to a woman?" And I don't, and I'm paraphrasing, and what would that be like? And I don't know how I would cope, blah blah blah. And she then turned around, introduced herself, and said, "I am the Prime Minister of Ireland, and I'm offended by what you've said, and you would never have said that to a man." And I'm thinking, "Go girl," But that authority gap is felt by really, really powerful women. And it reminded me of when I read The Confidence Code. And I remember Christine Lagarde, who is someone that I just admire so much. And even she was talking about having this confidence gap. Madeleine Albright talked about having this confidence gap. And it makes me mad because a lot of I guess a lot of the solutions are around women fixing themselves. And Catherine Fox, who's an Australian journalist, very esteemed, I admire her a lot, wrote a book a few years ago called "Stop Fixing Women," which I refer to a lot because it's one of my go-to books. And we've got to stop telling women how to fix themselves. And this authority gap is. It's okay to call it out, and we've got another series on our TV, our national broadcaster this week in Australia called "Why Women Are Mad," and I'm going, well, why women are angry? Well, hello, but I want the system to fix itself, and I want the people who have power in the system to fix the system. So, what does that mean? So, if there's an authority gap or a credibility gap, those of you who hold power right now can do something about that. And what that means is let's welcome, celebrate, and include alternate models of leadership, i.e., not white, not male, not cisgendered, not straight. So if you're something that's not that, let's welcome you and your style and your approach. But let's also give you a platform. So if I'm, and I can say proudly that I am very, very overt every single day about saying which woman of colour can I include today, because I'm a white woman that has a bucket load of privilege and I get enough airtime. So how can I include a woman of colour? So I want men who hold power to think, when I'm on the Zoom, when I'm around the boardroom, when I'm at the manufacturing site, when I'm in the design room, whatever it may be, look around you. Which woman hasn't had a go yet? Whose ideas haven't been heard? And whether it's women, generally women of colour, people of colour, people of diverse to you backgrounds, this is what we can do as humans. So I want leaders to really go, okay, so yeah, maybe there may be maybe there is an authority gap, but the authority gap's not with the woman. It's actually with the beholder, with the receiver of the information. Suspend judgment, engage her greatness, and give her an opportunity.
Right. So I want to wrap us up on something they mentioned in the podcast. So if you look up the authority gap on Apple iTunes or wherever on the full story.
I'll put it in the link. Yep.
You should be able to find it. And one of the things that they mentioned is tapping into the experience of trans people who have come out and come to live as men or women, and how does their experience change? And they talked about how when someone came out to live as a woman, they realize how much less people took them seriously. And another place that you can hear that very directly, there's a great TED Talk by Paula Stone called "I've Lived as a Man and as a Woman. Here's what I've learned." So as you just stated, I want to reiterate that the authority gap has to do with these unchecked biases and how we perceive other people. And we've got to, as leaders, come to recognize that and proactively make change. What else do you want to share on that, Michelle?
Yeah, and like you, I was reminded I've heard a number of, and having some trans women in my network, I do hear about so when I was a man, I got listened to. And in particular, I'm thinking of one particular woman who's involved in football, which is my great love. And yeah, and she can talk about, as a male footballer versus a female footballer, same person, same skills,
Right.
just the perception and the experience. And they are, trans people are extraordinarily, they have rich experience that can help us really, really unwind all of these biases. And we all have biases, but we've got to become more conscious of them, because frankly, we're leaving innovation and productivity and sustainable outperformance on the table if we don't, as organizations.
Right. So let's give a challenge or something. If you could have the leaders that listen to this today do one thing, what would it be?
I would give the leaders a challenge to say, I want you to find an underrepresented person, really pay attention to the underrepresented people in your team, your colleagues, your peers, and I want you to purposefully and intentionally amplify their voices this week. You can work out how you do that. And I've got lots of tips on my blog, but that's your challenge. So,
excellent. So if you're looking for those tips, head over to michelleredfern.com. And if you've enjoyed this talk, we'll be back next week. And of course, you can hear us on the Lead to Soar podcast, which is on all the major platforms and at leadtosoar.com. And so we ask you to don't just turn up.
You got to show up, people.
I love it. Thanks, Michelle.
Oh, me too. Thanks, Mel. See ya.